Good. I want to welcome you to the seventh in this series, or is it sixth? Sixth in this series of lectures. That's right, it only seems like seven. Sixth one, we're talking about virtues, traditional virtues, and what they mean for us today in our own lives. Trying to look at great people. Thought, what do we have? Mother Teresa last time, and the virtue of compassion. Talked a bit about that. It seemed like a lot of people sort of got into that and found a lot of insight and help from Mother Teresa. I was giving a lecture this morning, and I found myself quoting myself from the week before, talking about Mother Teresa and being a great ecumenical figure. Well, tonight we're going to talk about Cardinal Newman, and each one of these lectures is supposed to have sort of a problem that we're addressing. I think it's always important when we start thinking or talking, whatever, trying to teach, that there's a question involved, a problem. Each one of these times we've tried to elucidate a particular human problem, current problem, and then try to see how we can find some light on that problem from these great people. So tonight I wanted to talk about the problems of education, and then see what Cardinal Newman has to say about that and what that might mean to us in a contemporary context. The more I've done this whole thing on the virtues, the more I think it's a good idea. I mean, the approach generally of thinking of virtues, of looking for patterns in our lives, it seems a much healthier approach than looking at particular actions that we do, or just checking out isolated events. It seems like we do a lot better in terms of self-awareness, figuring out who we are and what we'd like to be and kind of directions we want to go by checking out the patterns in our lives, the characteristics that we have. And so we want to do that tonight again by looking at these virtues, these qualities, these things, as Thomas Aquinas told us, that become second nature to us so that we act in an easy, natural kind of way. It seems like that's what we're after in the moral life. Not to be able to grit our teeth to do things or push ourselves always to do things, but to get so we behave in a constructive way easily, naturally, so it flows. And that seems to be a good way of thinking about what the religious life is all about. Now, the problems of education, I'm going to do this quite simply, I think. I'm really only going to deal with two major problems tonight as I see them. The first of that is the whole general anti-intellectualism that I find in our culture today, sort of a putting down of the intellectual life, reaction against overly cerebral approaches to problems in life, an attempt to get away from an excessive rationalism. I see a number of things feeding into this business of anti-intellectualism today. I think one probably comes from the therapeutic movement in the culture, the rise of modern psychology, all of the interest in personal growth. Much of the psychological literature reminds us that we are not just heads but hearts. It tries to tell us that we have to be in touch with our emotions if we're going to function effectively in life. It tries to talk to us about the rest of our character or personality. You know, that rationalism always seems so narrowed and just centered in on logic and so on. And when the feeling has become that we miss so much about what life is all about, and we truncate ourselves in that way. So the psychological movement, the therapeutic movement has said, no, we're more than that. We're emotions, we're hearts in addition to heads. We got imaginations. There's a full range of experience that we have to be in touch with. And a lot of it says if we're going to grow and develop, we have to appropriate those emotions for ourselves, make them work for us instead of against us. Well, a lot of times when that kind of talk goes on and they encounter remnants of rationalism, of overly cerebral approaches, there's a great put-down of that. It says, that's no good. Intellectualism is bad. Let's get away from that. It's how you feel about things that count. Some of my friends that have gone through this movement, I've seen them move to the point where I can almost hardly talk to them anymore. It is, you cannot universalize about anything, any kind of general statements, because the response is, well, that's how you feel. I feel some different way, as though there's no way to adjudicate between those things, no way to parse it out, no way to talk about whether emotions are appropriate or not. So I think that whole movement is perhaps part of the anti-intellectualism that is afoot today. I think that perhaps we get another strain of this from the biblical theological world. That is, there's a lot of people who are very upset with theology, upset with the work of theologians that again sounded overly rational or cerebral. And there's a thing that says, well, let's just get back to the pure message of Jesus. Let's just read our Bible. You don't have to interpret it. That gets in the way of the message of the Lord. Don't think too much about it. Just live it. You just pick up the book and read it and let it work on you. Theology is bad in this viewpoint. It gets in the way. It's a barrier to a real close union with the Lord and the way He would speak to us through the Scriptures. So people will say, well, don't interpret, just read and drink in and hand one's life over to the Lord. The more you think about it, the worse shape you will be in. So out of the biblical world, and especially fundamentalism, we find, again, I think, a strain of anti-intellectualism. And I'll isolate just one other strain of thought that I think is going on today, and it's built in, I think, to the American psyche in a way. I've talked about the ambivalence that people feel towards education to begin with in the United States. There is the feeling that intellectuals are out of it, that academics live in an ivory tower. George Wallace had great fun in talking about the pointy-headed intellectuals, people who couldn't fix a flat tire if their life depended on it, can't do anything practical. All they do is sit in the ivory tower and theorize about things. And so there is a feeling in the culture that says, yeah, that's how those academics are. They're out of it. We're practical people. On the other hand, we get the business of people wanting to send their kids to college, of saving their money and denying themselves vacations and so on so they can afford to get their kids into contact with those pointy-headed intellectuals. It's a very strange feeling that we have in the culture. But what is happening today, I think, in higher education especially, is that we're beginning to wonder about the financial payoff of higher education. People that go through the school and get a degree, come out, and can't get a job. Especially people who would study something like philosophy, for example. I mean, what are they going to do after they graduate? Drive a cab. That's the, find some other kind of job. What could you possibly do with a degree in philosophy or any of the liberal arts? So there's this, it's not paying off so much. It's not clear that by putting all this time and effort into schooling that it's going to do one any good. We even got PhDs who can't get jobs. Sometimes people with master's degrees, it seems like it's harder for them to get a job than someone with an undergraduate degree. So, because I think of these financial problems, economic kind of problems, people are again saying, well, why bother? What good does it really do? What's the payoff in this higher education? Well, that's some way of setting the question for us. I think there is afoot this anti-intellectualism. There's a subtle put-down of all of this. Remember being at a convention of charismatic Catholics, and periodically throughout there would be these subtle put-downs of theologians, and not always so subtly. It just came across like it was always a bit of laughter. If the word theologian is said in certain circles, there's laughter. In certain circles like that, if you talk about philosophy or so on, people just get a funny look on their face as though those people are weird. So one encounters it, I think, in everyday life, in intellectual circles, even within academe itself. Oddly enough, one often gets that feeling of sort of this anti-intellectualism. Well, as I said, I want to look at John Henry Newman to tell us a little bit about this and see some of the ways that he lived his life and how he might challenge some of the anti-intellectualism we have going. Newman, as you know, dominates the 19th century there. He takes up a big portion of it. And Newman, from the beginning, was a bright lad, and he had a great interest in books and so on. In fact, books were always one of his most prized possessions. And it was finally determined after his early schooling that he would go to Oxford. He would go up to Oxford, go to school. And so he was taken there, registered, and was finally accepted then as a student in Trinity College. And when Newman got to Oxford, he fell in love with it. When you come in on the train to Oxford, you see the spires against the skyline, and it is really a magnificent sight. And Newman just fell in love with it. It became his home and his place. Oxford is a community of scholars. As some of you know, I spent a few years at Oxford and living in that environment. It is a place where intellectualism is prized, where deep conversation is the order of the day, where half the time in conversation you couldn't figure out what people were talking about. You know, there was always classical allusions and authors. And I saw one young man come to Oxford, a brilliant young man, and he was a tremendous background, everything, came working hard and everything, and after about 6 months there, he was just about destroyed. He came to me one day and said, you know, I feel like I don't know anything. I just know nothing, because it was that constant environment where you're always interacting with people who were so skilled in their fields and knew so much. Oxford, in one way, is a very specialized kind of thing. One of my favorite stories about Oxford, I hope I don't get off on this too much. I spent all night doing this. But I remember one fellow there by the name of Bywater. And I said to Bywater one day, you know, what is your field? And Bywater said to me, a field is something you plow. So I tried another approach and asked Bywater, you know, well, what he lectured on or something, you know, trying to find a way to pose the question in a legitimate, acceptable way. Well, Bywater says, well, he lectures on the philosophy of geography. I said, my, that is interesting. Philosophy of geography, I never heard of that. I said, by the way, how many students do you have? And he said, well, I had one 2 years ago. And there's rumors that one might come next year. So people are sort of specialized there. Their fields, not their fields. I never did find out. I asked that question in 2 years. Evidently, field was not the right word. But anyway, Oxford, a community of scholars and just a bright intellectual atmosphere. Although in Newman's time, it was said that it really wasn't like that. It was in a century of decline and just coming out of that. And where the students did a lot of heavy drinking, evidently. Spent a lot of times on pub crawls, as they called them. I think it's a neat phrase, pub crawls, you know. Anyway, that was part of the life there at that time. So Newman gets there and taken by the whole thing. He's one of those brilliant students in the university. And the thing about Oxford is you don't take exams till the end. I mean, you don't take them like every week or month or semester or year. You take them once in the middle and once at the end. So there's a little bit of pressure riding on things at the end. In fact, not only that, but what grades you get are known. That's published in the Times. And the pressure for one's whole life stands on those exams. It's just a heavy kind of thing. One's whole existence, one's whole public life of becoming a politician or moving up in society hinges on those exams. Well, Newman was thought that he would get a first, as they call it, in both greats, that's the classics, and in math. Fully expected. Everyone was looking for great things from him. Somehow he got into the exams and blew them. he got thirds. Thirds are not good. It doesn't look good in the paper. To make a third in your exams just usually dooms your career. You're sort of done for life. But Newman recovered from that. Didn't seem to throw him off psychically as much as one would expect. Came back and he had his scholarship for a while yet, did more studies, and eventually applied for a fellowship to Oriel College, which is one of the great institutions there, and celebrated for its learning. And he took the exams in that, and they investigated him and so on, and he was made a fellow of Oriel College. Well, for Newman, as he wrote later on, that was the greatest event of his life, to be made a fellow of Oriel College. It was there that he would do more of his studies. It was there that he would become a professor himself. He would be a tutor, tremendously interested in his students. At Oxford, you work on a one-to-one basis. You write a paper each week, and then you come and talk to your professor on an individual basis. At Oxford, you have large lectures and one-to-one. You don't have anything in between. So he became a tutor and was extremely personable with his students, took a great interest in them, and so on. During that period, he was ordained a priest in the Anglican Church, which is his own heritage. Began in the Anglican community as being part of the more Protestant wing, not a high church kind of Anglican. He became the rector of St. Mary's Church, the curate there on High Street, one of the most important churches in all of Oxford. So here he was at the height of his career. He had made it. He'd done everything that any intellectual or scholar could possibly want. He had a community around him. He had the interaction with the students. He had opportunity to do his research and writing and so on. This rich atmosphere. It was at that time that Newman and some of the other people in the early 30s began to be disenchanted with the way things were going in the Anglican Church. And because things were in need of reform, the clergy, it was said, were not always faithful to their duties and tasks. They might be more out on the hunt, or in our own terms today, I guess, the golf course, than doing their duties. And the church really didn't seem to be standing for much and so on. And so the government looked like it was going to be intervening in all of this. And so it seemed necessary to mount this reform of the Anglican community. And some of Newman's friends, Pusey and Keble and himself, became interested in all of this. And they began to write these tracts. They ended up writing 90 of them altogether, which talked about the reform of the Anglican Church. Well, our friend Newman began getting into this more and more, talking about the reform of the Anglican Church. For him, Anglicanism was the right way to go because it stood in the middle as he saw it. On the one side was the Protestant way of doing things. They had gotten too far away from the original church the way it should be. On the other hand was the Roman Catholic Church, and they were off base. They had all these popish kind of things, all these additions, accretions, traditions that had grown up over the years. Newman saw the Anglican Church as the middle way, the via media, as he called it, through these extremes. And so he wanted to reform that church, and he began thinking about it and writing about it and so on. And he mounted a study of the fathers of the church. The early fathers like St. Athanasius, who was fighting against the Arian heresy in the 4th century. And St. Basil and St. Augustine, the early fathers of the church. And he started studying these people. And as he would study them, it began to put doubts in his mind about his own Anglican church. As he would read some of them, it began to seem to him as though when he looked at them, he would see a mirror of something else. it didn't look like the church that he belonged to. It didn't seem right. And so he began thinking about all this. He began to write in this direction. Created great consternation. Catholics weren't even allowed to go to Oxford in those days. A Catholic couldn't get in to begin with. And so there was a tremendous anti-Catholic feeling in that community. And so Newman is starting to write like this and preach his sermons in this way, really raised the ire of many people. But he stuck with it. Intellectually, he followed out the truth, went after the truth, kept studying the Fathers, and before long, he had to begin to resign his positions in Oxford. Couldn't keep them anymore in good conscience. Gave up all that he had wished for in his life because his head told him that he was in the wrong place, or that he might be in the wrong place. So he left Oxford, went to a place called Littlemore. He built his own place there. They lived a very Spartan life with some of his friends, and were careful about their diet, and they prayed a lot, and he continued to study and so on. And before long, he reached the decision that he had to leave the Anglican Church and become a Roman Catholic. He wrote about 30 letters to his close friends. You got to remember, he was a prominent person. You know, there was a tremendous consternation. It would be hard to imagine the impact that made on England when he moved in this direction. I mean, we're talking about headlines in the papers and so on. Major kind of event. And in a simple way, he had this visiting priest who heard his confession over 2 nights. Took him 2 nights to make his confession. Then he was received into the Catholic Church after that, began to live a life of the Catholic. He must have been, about 44 years old when he did that. He lived half his life as an Anglican and half as a Roman Catholic. Before I try to draw out some implications of all of that, I think that I might just point out that his life as a Catholic did not go all that smoothly from then on. As a matter of fact, he had a lot of difficulties and problems. People always were suspicious of him. They said that really while he was an Anglican, he had been sort of a closet Roman Catholic. He hadn't been true to himself. The people in the Roman Church didn't trust him in many ways, gave him a bad time. Eventually went to Rome, completed some studies, and then was ordained a priest in the Roman Catholic Church. Decided at that point to become an Oratorian. He was very taken by the life of St. Philip Neri, 16th century reformer, and a person that Newman looked up to because of his personal qualities and his commitments in life to helping others and so on. And then he comes back and he founds one of these oratories, a little grouping of these followers of St. Philip Neri in England, in Birmingham. Has all kinds of reversals. One of the things I'm going to talk about next is that he tried to found a university in Dublin that ran into a lot of difficulties. He wanted to establish an oratory in Oxford, and that was blocked by his bishop. He was called upon to do a translation of the Bible into English, and that was delayed, and finally never got around to doing it. We are much the poorer of that. He was a master of the English language. If we would have had a translation of that, it would be terrific if he had done that. So he was always under suspicion. He wrote a marvelous essay about consulting the laity in matters of the faith. Newman was intellectually way ahead of his time. Talked about the importance of being in touch with the laity. While I'm on that point, most of Newman's friends were among the laity. Didn't seem to have much clericalism in him. He dealt well with families. He loved little children. He was a very warm person that way. Well, anyway, he had this great feeling for the laity and said that really the laity needed to be consulted in these matters. And one of his bishops said, the laity shouldn't do anything. They just should exist and obey, and they aren't to be consulted. And so Newman was put under a cloud again in Rome, as though he was somebody who really was a dangerous kind of heretic. Well, just to complete that story, finally, way at the end of his life, when he's very old, a new pope comes in, Leo the 13th, with more modern ideas, and Newman was seen to be a prophetic figure, and despite a lot of difficulties, Newman was made a cardinal very late in his life. A sort of approbation on his life after all the suspicion and difficulty that he had gone through. And as a cardinal then, he sort of had a new lease on life, and people in England accepted him in a new way, accorded a lot of honors and so on. Okay, I mean, sort of a rough sketch, I suppose, of what went on in his life. But what interests me, of course, about that is his intellectual honesty. It was his head who took, his heart said, stay at Oxford. Everything about it, life was great. He had a future there. He wouldn't have had to make any waves and so on. But he was faithful to his head. His head kept taking him to the truth. One of his great images of God was as the light. That was what grabbed him about God. God was source of illumination. Truth is what mattered to him. Passion for truth, no matter where that takes you. One of his ideas was that we had to follow our conscience even though it was objectively wrong. Even though by objective standards our conscience, our judgment told us to do something that was wrong, you still had to do it. Because by being faithful to oneself, true to what was in one's heart, that was the way you would achieve growth in life. So there was none of this easy thing. Well, if authority says to do it, you do it. He really had a lot of problems with authority like that. Oh, he loved the authority in one way, and he'd never go against it and so on. But he said that you had to follow your conscience because that was truth for you. That's where you were being led, and that would lead you eventually into a greater life. Now, Newman was not a rationalist. He wasn't some guy who just said, well, you have to assent to the truths of the faith because you figured every last bit out. He had this notion of what he called the illative sense. The illative sense meant that you could move in a direction, make a decision if you had a convergence of probabilities. Very modern thinker in this way. He said that most times you can't figure it out black or white. You can't know exactly for sure what you're supposed to do. But what you've got to do is see if there aren't these convergence of probabilities, so things start to come together and say, this is the direction one ought to go. He did insist against the Protestant tendency that faith is not merely trust, not merely a feeling, but faith does involve an intellectual assent to God's revealed truth. He was big on that. Remember when I lectured on Luther, I talked a lot about faith as trust, as commitment, as handing one's life over. Newman liked to talk about faith as an intellectual assent to the revealed truths given to us by God through Jesus Christ. Newman's become, in our country, the patron saint of Catholics on campus. We have Newman clubs. Newman, his name was picked because he was so much in favor of the intellectual life, because he loved books, because he wanted to learn. He had this passion for truth. And he stands as that for us. He stands as a sort of antidote to this anti-intellectualism. He puts the intellectual life in a happy kind of light. On Newman, it wears easily. It looks good. He comes across as a warm person, as one who cared and was compassionate, one who would never hurt. One of his definitions, that's where we get that definition of a gentleman. That is, a gentleman is one who would never on purpose offend anyone else. And so he would never use his intellect to beat people down. But it was seen as a way of illuminating the human situation, of leading us forward, of giving us a delight in part of the faculties God has given us. That's what he said. We've got this mind. And one of the great joys of life is to cultivate that mind. So Newman is a refreshing figure. He's a courageous person. And he makes the intellectual life, to me, seem not just palatable, but endearing and attractive. Oh, it's great to be a thinker like he was. Great to be immersed in the world of books, to love intellectual conversation, to get beneath the surface sometimes and talk about things that matter, to wrestle with an idea and really think it through, to have the deep satisfaction of arriving at a deeper insight about what's going on in my life. Ah, yeah, the intellectual life, the verve of it all, the excitement of good, challenging conversation, of an argument, even if one loses the argument, of having that sort of excitement going, exhilaration of having to think and be challenged. Oh, where that gets lost in the intellectual world, in the anti-intellectualism. In that world, if you say, I feel, that's the best answer you can give. In classes even, we're reduced to that. You know, well, what do you think about this? Well, I feel it's this way. Sometimes maybe a teacher, I say, I don't care how you feel about it. I want to know what you think about it. Now, I want some reasons for what you're going to do. I want some thought going on here. It seems like an attractive kind of thing, at least. At least it's a challenge to the anti-intellectualism, which I think gets soft and mushy. And before long, one wonders, where's the substance of it all? If it's just all what we feel about something, then how can we make judgments? How do we sort out? How do we penetrate? So, Newman speaks to us of a different world, I think, of a world where intellectual life is fun, exhilarating, and challenges perhaps the outlook that's prevalent in our culture. Well, at this point, I want to take a little break and invite you to do some response to that. I'd invite you to respond in an intellectual way. Instead of turning to the person next to you and said, that bugs me, or I feel that this, why don't you try to think? Why don't you tell somebody what you think about what I just said, and maybe, talk in this more intellectual vein that I was just suggesting here. Let's take a couple minutes to do that. Have in our modern educational system. I guess we talk about it these days under the title of careerism or vocationalism. That is the whole idea that education is involved simply in preparing one to get a job in life. That the reason we go to school is to get a degree, and we get the degree in order that we can get into the job market and so we can earn a decent living. Therefore, much of education gets directed that way, so that we have to always have a slant in particular areas of education, so it's moving us in the direction of being able to better ourselves economically. All different disciplines within universities get touched by that. I mean, within university structure, what really happens, of course, is that the departments are fighting for students, and they have to keep trying to figure out how to increase the enrollment in their particular college or program. And in order to do that, they have to make it attractive, and the way it's made attractive is by one way or another showing that it is profitable, that to go in our program will get you a better job or move you forward in the socioeconomic order. That takes over everything, even philosophy programs. We have in one university I'm acquainted with, the philosophy moves in the direction of applied philosophy. They've been able to work it out that, by showing that getting this degree in philosophy will enable you to do better in the job market. And they've related it to business interests and so on. Actually, they've developed quite a fine program that way, an effective program. You see this problem all over. As some of you know, I'm writing the pastoral letter for the bishops on campus ministry, and part of my job is to go around and listen to people now and to pick up ideas at various universities and from various campus ministers. And one of the things you hear all over as I'm listening to people is that no one's got any love of learning, or where has that gone? Where is the question of learning for the sake of learning? It's all getting prostituted in a way to this business of getting a job. that's all that seems to count, is how do we get the students, therefore, into our program. And then we get grade inflation, so that the professors give higher and higher grades so as not to turn the students off. Part of this really is the whole grade business, that many people are in school not to learn something, not to see how they can get educated, but how to get a higher point average. And that becomes what really counts. I was talking to a professor the other day and said it just drives her wild the way, students will just, fight for that 1 point. We were in a discussion with some students the other day, and we were talking about, the great drive to make the dean's list, or the great drive to do better. One of the young women was saying, I wonder who will remember 10 years from now, if I was on the dean's list or not. She was trying to put some perspective on it. She's just graduated herself, I suppose, looking back a little on her career. But part of it, I remember, when I come at this question, I probably should clarify some things. I don't want to speak from any pedestal and all this. I remember when I was in school, I always said I don't think I had a serious thought till I was about 24. So I remember it. I have great empathy for students who are struggling and just trying to learn. I've told this story before, but I remember one of my professors one time asked me a question, and I always answered questions through memory. If in the seminary, if they'd ask me a question, I would have the answer memorized, so I just tell them the answer. Well, one time I didn't know the memorized answer. So the professor asked me a question, I didn't know the answer. He said, well, think about it. Well, that was different. Think about it? What does that mean? Well, think about it. So I adopted my thinking posture, I really got into it. And that was a new experience, I was thinking, and so I thought, and I finally says, well, this is what I think. And the professor said, that's absolutely ridiculous. That's a ridiculous answer. Well, I didn't think again for a while. It didn't pay off. Enough thinking. But in other words, we used to have this thing that, exams got in the way of learning. If one was into something and, really started to read something and try to, because one had a genuine interest and were starting to learn, then it became time to take an exam. You had to stop and memorize these answers again so that one could regurgitate those on the exams. Well, we all know that, all those stories of school, whereas you wonder where's the excitement of it all, or where's this big learning bit. It's more like a game, like jumping through hoops. That's the common thing when people go on their doctorate. Well, how many hoops do I have to jump through? What kind of strange things will they have me doing? What kind of games do I have to play to get this higher degree? So, I don't want to paint a totally dark picture of education, because I suppose I meet students who are really interested, and I teach in the honors program at this university, and I have 15 students, and they're all eager to learn, and they study and read, and they've got some background and so on. It's marvelous. So I know it from the other side as well of having good learning situations. But when we look at the thing as a whole, I don't think we want to say that our average university in the United States is a community of scholars, or a place where great intellectual life is afoot. I think a lot of parents who maybe never were at college and send their kids to college, I think, have that in their mind, that that's how it is. And I suppose that's part of the great disappointment or frustration of people to find out that so many students are really not that interested and maybe are out drinking on Thursday night instead of hitting the books and so on, and that the standards aren't all that high. If some of you would read the papers that I have had in classes previously and examine it for English and for sentence structure and so on, I suppose people would just be appalled. I suppose many people who haven't been in school for a long time wouldn't believe it. Isn't it interesting how we're getting better in so many ways, better diets, and we're improving in so many ways. We've got all these things, and yet the SAT scores keep going down and down, although I guess they've leveled just lately. But, isn't that odd, with all the great advantages and the enrichments and so on, that we're doing more poorly with the education? Well, one of the senses of that is that because the education has become too pragmatic, that it's just designed to get people to pass exams, move ahead. In fact, a lot of the earlier education these days is just designed to increase the scores in the SAT exams. People take special classes just to be able to improve on those kind of things instead of thinking of something else. Well, so the problem is vocationalism, careerism, over-interest in grades, making it that way, and a concomitant lack of love of learning, of the intellectual life, and so on. Well, let's look at Cardinal Newman now and say something about him and how he might respond to all of this. Newman had a chance to do all of this practically. After he became a Catholic and was ordained a priest, came back to England and was in Birmingham establishing his oratory and getting that all together. He got a call from Cardinal Cullen in Ireland to submit a paper to him about creating a Catholic university in Ireland. They had a lot of problems. They weren't happy with what was going on educationally there for a lot of different reasons. And they felt the need to create their own Catholic university. So they asked Newman to write a proposal for that, and which he did. And with that, they eventually brought him over and adopted some of his proposals and allowed him to begin the Catholic University in Dublin. And there were a lot of fights with that and so on. The bishops weren't all agreed on what ought to be happening with this. And eventually, the Cardinal Cullen wasn't all that happy with the directions Newman was going. He wanted Newman really to just sort of, I don't know, to be a lackey, but just to be sort of a mild-mannered person who would just go along with what the hierarchy wanted to do. And Newman wasn't like that, and he had his definite ideas on how a university was going to run. Well, part of Newman's task was to sell this notion. He was made the rector and told to start the university, but he had to sell it to the people. Oh, and he had to come at it in a number of different ways. He had to fight those on the one side, I suppose, that we would call the secularists today, who saw no need for a Catholic university. And on the other side, he had to deal with the bishops, the hierarchy, especially the more conservative ones, who wanted a very strict kind of Catholic university, almost something that would look like a seminary. Well, Newman comes into this situation, and he is forced now to talk about education, to sell it. So they set up for him this lecture series, and I think he lectured each week on a given topic connected with university life. We now know the collection of those eventually of 10 lectures that he gave as the great classic work, The Idea of a University. And that is, where we get the best of Newman's thinking on this whole question of what education is all about. Well, let me try to sketch out some of the things that Newman was interested in here. He wanted the ideal to be a university would be where all disciplines would be taught, where nothing that the human mind had come to would be ruled out. Obviously, one part of that would be to have theology taught in the university. It would be essential that that would be one of the faculties that would exist there, along with law and medicine and the arts, which would be divided up into the humanities and the sciences. It's sort of the way he organized his thinking for structuring this university. At the beginning now he's giving the lectures, but later on he actually establishes this university. It's actually existing. He's the rector there of that for about 7 years. So in this university, theology has to play a crucial role. Theology is that which helps us to see things whole. It is that which tries to understand the deepest parts of life. One of his lectures is on showing that a university without theology is not a university. How can you claim to be a university if you don't have a department of religion or theology in our own terms? How can you take that important part of human existence, part of what we are as human beings? Religion has had such an influence on the world, on culture, and so on. How can you set that aside and call yourself a university? An important question for us to deal with today. That was part of his argument. The other part of his argument was that theology really is a discipline in its own right, that it has a knowledge. Theology isn't just feeling. It isn't just trying to convert people or give sermons. Theology is a science, as Thomas Aquinas told us, a study, a habit of mind, a virtue in itself, an intellectual virtue, to be able to think theologically about our relationship with the powers that run this world. So that for those two reasons, any decent university is going to have theology, and you have to have a theology faculty to teach that. Newman was big on what we would call a liberal education. His idea was that we had to cultivate the mind. That's what really counted. Not professionalism, not to train people to do anything, and not even to make people virtuous. He didn't think you went to the university to become a saint. You didn't go there to get the moral virtues. You went there to get the intellectual virtues. And what you were supposed to do was to cultivate the powers of the mind. Power. And that's what studying ought to be about, really. Not pragmatic, not how is this useful? How will it get me a job or something? But simply for the love of learning, to cultivate the habits of the mind so that one could think clearly and succinctly and express oneself properly. How was one going to do this? Newman's great way was through the study of the classics of Greek and Latin literature. He felt that through the tradition, had been the way that people had trained their minds, and it still was the best way of doing that. Deep kind of study. He thought that what we needed was more close reading of the text, as we call it today. That is, he thought that we scattered ourselves too much, that people, when they learn, they get a smattering of this, a bit of that. What the 20th century existentialist Martin Heidegger called a curious kind of learning, where you get sort of excited about something for a little few weeks, and you dabble in it, and then you move on to something else, go around like this. Newman felt that is the way not to get educated. Then you have just amassed information. You've gotten this information, that information, but that wasn't what the cultivated mind had. The real thinking person was able to probe deeply into one particular thing. And the way one would do that is by a close reading of a great text. That is, line by line. Well, that is just going through it like that. Newman just flashed on a story. I hope I can tell this without being too self-serving, but I remember a lad in one of my classes was taken by my own teaching and the way I did it and so on, and he came to me saying, I want to be like you are, like that. I want to get to where I could present in class like that and to do all those things. He was excited about that. I said, let me show you something. I took off the shelf one of my books, 500-page tome, and I opened it up. I said, just take a look at this. And in there, for every paragraph in there, I had written a summary in my own words of what was in that book. And of course, many of my books are like that. And I said, you want to take in the life of scholarship and learning, I said, take a look at that. That's the kind of thing it takes. The kind of drudgery work, the kind of just fighting your way through something to understand, to move that way. And the kid was very sad, the young man, and just shook his head and walked off. In fact, he left my class. bright lad. I suppose maybe there was a better way of doing that, but it was a question of saying, well, what's at stake at this? Whatever learning is about. But anyway, that was an example of my own method of close reading of the text, is to take each paragraph and to try to put in my own words what the paragraph says. Not what I feel about it, but not what it makes me think of, but what's he saying. There's that distinction between making a judgment about something and understanding something. First step in learning is understanding what is said. Most of us jump to judgments too soon, like that's crazy, or I love that, that's terrific. But it seems like Newman asked us to go through and first probe it, first get at it, understand what is going on there. Close reading of the text is a major way of doing this. Another thing that Newman thought, interestingly enough, of getting this liberal kind of education was by contact with other people. In a sense, his ideas seem to work mostly in a smaller environment, a school where there's interaction, where the medical students and the law students would be sort of living close together and would be talking to one another, where you could have deep conversation among people from different backgrounds. He felt that that was extremely important to learning and this liberal kind of education. And the other interaction he thought was vital came out of his own experience at Oxford when he was a tutor. His own leader didn't want him to do this. He thought the Oxford dons ought to walk around very aloof. And Newman didn't do that. He went with the students and talked to them and tried to engage them one-to-one and to move them along. And he felt that that was one of the great ways that one became liberally educated as well. But it wasn't just theology and so on that Newman had in mind. He thought, and this sort of liberal education, he actually founded in the University School of Medicine that still exists now and still turns out doctors in Ireland. So there was what we would call this more practical side to it. But his notion was, in general, that before you went into these kinds of specialized disciplines, you did your couple years of this liberal education. First, you learned how to think, cultivate the mind, get a love of learning, go after the truth. And then one could go on and specialize. He felt that there was advantage to this, that this would turn to the advantage of society, for example, that if we got more liberally educated people, they would be able to think on their feet. They would be able to challenge the premises of the society. They would be able to create a better world, precisely because they were trained to think for themselves. The other disciplines then had their role. After you had your liberal kind of education, then you could specialize. And again, he felt that you would do much better in that by that kind of background and preparation. One of the things that Newman was after and is always often talked about is the education of the gentleman. Now, the gentleman is a person of refinement. Gentleman doesn't offend anyone else. A gentleman is able to speak with others and to go on their wavelength. And gentleman has an expanded vision of things. The gentleman is able to penetrate to the core and has things in order and place. His mind works in a clear fashion. He knows where to put the different bits of knowledge that he's accumulated. See, Newman said that, just getting knowledge is not the purpose of education. In fact, he felt that got in the way of being a liberally educated person sometimes. Yeah, he said the young people have to accumulate knowledge, but the only thing that really involved in education is knowing how to put that together, seeing connections. I must say in my classes, when I see that happening, students will say, we'll be going along, at some point they'll read a particular author, and they'll say, well, that reminds me of what somebody else said. And that, as a teacher, that becomes a great moment. Then the students are beginning to make those link-ups. They're beginning to get hold of how it all fits together so that there's a core of knowledge and one knows how to place any new learning that one has. So we're getting a picture then of the gentleman that Newman wanted to produce in this learning. Remember, he says the university was not, first of all, to produce virtuous people. It wasn't to make better Christians. It was to produce the gentleman, the person with the intellectual virtues who could then think for themselves. The Christian thing would happen in other ways. The gentleman was the product of all of this. Now, there's so much more that could be said about all of this. Newman's got wonderful ideas about what the gentleman is like and how education fits in and what ought to happen. I suppose that we need to look a little bit at what that might say to us today. What are we going to say about a liberal education? That's so far from our consciousness. I mean, can you imagine sending a young person off to school to learn for the sake of learning? Well, what are you going to do? What are you going to become? How are you going to get a job? I mean, it's almost, we're not even like close to Newman's idea. I mean, it becomes hard for people to envision what it would mean just to learn for the sake of learning and to cultivate these virtues. So I'm not sure that it makes much sense to say we're going to do this in the United States. Someone has said that Newman's idea would work probably only in a small enclosed environment where everyone was committed to learning. I mean, I guess my years in Oxford tells me that, in there some of this seems possible. But I mean, if we thought we were going to do that here at this university tomorrow, I mean, it would be hard to imagine how one would go about it. I remember when I went to teach in the seminary, I suppose I had a lot of these ideals, and I was going to get those seminarians thinking, because I remember I never thought, and I was going to encourage them to think. And we started these little discussions and so on, and one-to-one, and asking questions, and man, that's like a brick wall. Well, that isn't what happens. You come in and read the book to us, and we'll regurgitate it to you on the exam. What's all this bit about thinking? And so you run up against a system. If you go through all your schooling and no one encourages you to think, then it's almost impossible, it seems, to start. So we have to figure out, how we're going to make this real in any way. And the other kind of problem with putting in is that there's a certain elitism about it. I mean, Oxford is an elite place, and Newman was an intellectual of the highest order. That ideal he had for the Catholic University of Ireland is so much up here in a way that there's an elitism about it. One wonders how you could even do that with most people. Certainly couldn't have a system like we've got where everybody can get into the university. You just couldn't do that. On the other hand, it seems to me there's really valuable things to be learned here about this. That the average person can do, average parent can do with the youngsters and so on. It seems to me that there is a proper cultivation of the intellectual life. That becomes part of the task of parental generation. I think it means so much when parents read to their children. We know that if there was discussion and people were sort of called upon to think, if parents did that. I still remember I was sitting at the dinner table. I don't know how old I was. I'm thinking I was about 8 years old or something, and it seems to me my mom and dad were talking about whether they were going to buy something. I don't know, it was a refrigerator or something. And at one point in the conversation, my father looked at me and he says, "Well, what do you think about that?" And I remember I felt about 10 feet tall, Well, it seems to me, there's a way of encouraging the intellectual life, of encouraging thinking. I often want to do that with my students, and yet one backs off, at least I back off, because students are so fragile. If in my class I would do the kind of things a lot of times I'd really like to do, which is to say, now why did you say that? And what did that word mean there? And back that up with some argumentation now. People are, I find students are pretty fragile that way. I don't have many of them who could take that. They would feel attacked or put down. But it seems to me that more of that could be done. At least maybe we could sort of get in the habit of doing it or trying to do it. And I suppose personally, it seems to me things could be done that way. That where we would think about things like a lecture like this. I was talking to someone not long ago who told me that after these lectures they go out and discuss it. I said, man, that's terrific. It makes me feel good. Where people would get into debate about those things and wrestle with those kinds of ideas. It seems to me we can do that. How about sometimes reading a book, instead of trying to read 5 books, read one and read it closely and try to put in a sentence, what a chapter meant. In one sentence, say what it meant, or one paragraph, or one section of the book, to try to train ourselves a little bit more to think this way. How about trying to concentrate on the business of trying to understand before we would make judgments? Probably most of us are involved in that. We judge too soon. Say yea or nay, true or false, before it's time. How about suspending that a little bit so that we could actually look back and say, well, what is being said here first? What did she mean by that? What is this author saying first before I say yes or no to it? Well, I just think that Cardinal Newman could do something for us. I mean, he could sort of give an impetus to the liberal arts in this document that I'm writing for the bishops. That's one thing I'd like to get in there is the building up of the liberal arts, the idea of trying to say that philosophy has a value and so on. Well, we're dealing with, I think, in our culture, part of anti-intellectualism and inability perhaps to grapple with ideas the way we should. Cardinal Newman challenges that and says there's another way, that is the cultivation of the intellectual virtues of wisdom and of understanding, and that there's a deep, clean joy that comes in that kind of effort. I want to thank you for your time and attention during this whole series. Or about excoriating the anti-intellectualism among Catholics in the United States. He's a dean of Catholic historians, still alive. And Ellis wrote this famous article saying, well, where is the Catholic intellectuals? Oh, and he went down the line. I mean, we just weren't producing them. And part of the theory that went with that all was that, well, we couldn't be because we were in, as they called it, the brick and mortar stage, that we were all the sons and daughters of immigrants, and the immigrants had to try to find jobs, and they were busy building churches and schools and so on, and that we didn't have time to develop the intellectual life. And that's become a great critique of the Catholics in our country. And I'll just show you a more recent example of that. Maybe some of you saw it, is Andrew Greeley went off on the same tangent and began to look at that, and he did a devastating critique of the Catholic colleges in the United States, showing that none of our Catholic colleges, and according to the way he did it, even ranked, in the top, the top 50, or the upper half. It was just a terrible indictment of Catholic colleges. He was sort of carrying on to the tradition of John Tracy Ellis, saying, what are we doing, and why are we in such bad shape? Even the places that we look up to and think are so good didn't rate any place in these listings of the good universities. So, anyway, someone asked me at the break. I don't know what more I want to say about it, except I think what Ellis's critique did was get a lot of people thinking. And I mean, my sense of it is that, we've really moved ahead on that. I've talked before about Catholic biblical scholarship in the United States. I feel really good about that. I mean, we've produced some of the most outstanding scripture scholars around. Father Raymond Brown, people like that, are looked up to by everybody around the world. We've probably, for the first time, produced a world-class theologian in David Tracy at the University of Chicago, probably the first Catholic theologian that we've produced in the United States that really has been looked up to as a general, all-around great theologian. So, I mean, I think we're making progress on all of that. It takes time to develop traditions and to build up a love of learning. I was talking to someone else at the break talking about minorities in our culture and the difficulties they have very often in the university setting. And one begins to think, I mean, just when you take the systematic destruction of black family life, for example, and then you look at how that affects affects interest in education and what happens in the homes and so on. Well, there's a reason for these things, and it takes time then to build up that kind of tradition. That's why we can't seem to solve these problems overnight. And I think there has to be a great sensitivity to that. I am not, I think my own sensibilities are all in an egalitarian level. I mean, I didn't like the elitism of Oxford, frankly. I don't like the hints of elitism in Newman, to speak personally about my own reactions. I don't want to keep anybody out of the universities that want to learn. So on. I mean, I think perhaps there's a whole other kind of way that we have to foster thinking. My own opinion would be that we could probably start in practice, start in work, start in life, and find ways of building curricula around that. Apart from just this pure disciplining of the mind from reading the classics. Although I think great books programs are terrific. That would be a great way to learn. They asked me in one seminary how I would revamp the curriculum. I say what I do is read the great books. I went through 8 years of a seminary, 4 years of graduate study in theology, and I had read almost no great books in theology. I probably hadn't read any but one, the Summa of Thomas Aquinas. I don't even think I read anything of Augustine, come to think of it, directly. Well, I did. I read it in Latin. I take that back. It's probably why I didn't remember much. But, great books. I mean, there's a tradition. What bugs, I'm off and running. What bugs teachers, of course, today is there's not a common fund of knowledge. I mean, you can't walk into a class and say, well, now we all know what Augustine said about this. Now let's build on that. Or we all know what Aquinas said. Or you can't walk into a class in a seminary of fourth-year seminary students and presume that. Or that people know who Aristotle is, or Plato, or the people who founded our Western tradition, or any of the great thinkers or philosophers. I mean, you just can't presume that. We haven't been trained that way. And geez, it's to our detriment. I mean, they've shaped our thinking. That's what we all build on. One of the things after you start learning some of that stuff is you can read so much faster, because then you read an author and you say, aha, he's just repeating what Plato said, and you turn the pages quickly. I mean, there's something to be said for a common, and this just isn't for us. I mean, this is for the salvation of the republic and eventually of the world. I mean, without a common bond, what holds us together? I mean, how do we talk to the next generation? If you're not into rock music, how do you communicate? I mean, we're talking here civilization, Western culture, whatever it is that holds it together, keeps it together. We talk crime in the streets and things falling apart. Well, you got to have common discourse. We can't talk to people about what we've all read, or authors we know, or symbols we have in common. Stop. Comments, fill-ins, objections, questions? That's why I saved this lecture till last. Yeah, I forgot to bring all that up, didn't I? I was talking about intellectual virtues and so on. There's a major movement. In fact, this past Christmas time, there was a major conference on Newman down in Florida, and
I was talking to one of the guys on the phone who's very behind this and working on it, this canonization of Newman. People think that it would be most valuable. They think it would be valuable precisely because they sense the anti-intellectualism, and they want to build up this whole Newman movement among Catholics on campuses, and they think that this canonization will revive interest in all this, that more of his papers are being published and so on. I think they're all available now as far as I know. But anyway, that would create new interest. Well, they think that, people argue that he really was a saintly figure. I didn't talk much about his character or personality. He was a committed Christian. There's an article written saying that Newman's real goal was not the creation of the gentleman at all, but his real goal was the creation of the Christian on the model of St. Philip Neri. That he understood the limitations of what a university could do, and he thought the various disciplines should have their own autonomy, like law and medicine, and the church shouldn't be mucking around in there directly. But for his own life, and for the people he dealt with, and the young people he interacted with, he wanted holiness. He wanted to be close to God. Newman had a regular prayer life. He got up early and in the morning. He had off of his room a little prayer room at Oriel, where he would go in and kneel and spend long hours in prayer. He was a good man in many ways. He was kind to people. He was morally upright. He was generous with what he had. I'm thinking about the fact that one guy, he was involved in a libel suit once. In fact, he lost. He was sued by a fellow because he had said that he had some bastard children or some sexual liaisons that he shouldn't have had, and so on. And the guy sued him, and Achilles is the guy's name, and he won the suit against Newman. And it looked like Newman was going to be put in jail, as a matter of fact. And this was after his conversion to Catholicism when he was back in England. But the judge only fined him, and it was at that point that people all over the world really sent money to Newman to pay his court costs and to pay for his trial. In other words, he had caught the popular imagination at that time. In fact, he dedicated his book, The Idea of a University, to all the people around the world who had contributed to this. So there's all kinds of attractive virtues in Newman. That sensitivity and so on to other people. Now, on the other side of it, there are people who speak against Newman and against his canonization. One theory is that he probably wouldn't get canonized because much of his life, as it would come out, would show him to be in tremendous conflict with the Catholic Church authorities. He was treated shabbily. It looks like one of the cardinals tried to keep him from being made a cardinal at the end, just by not mailing notes and papers and holding some back and sending one document to the Pope when Newman had written a cover letter for it and so on. Or one of his bishop friends wrote a cover letter for him, and he held it back. In other words, a lot of machinations that went on, dirty church politics. The church hierarchy would look bad in any kind of thorough investigation of Newman. I suppose the other thing that is commonly talked about with Newman is his apparently hypersensitivity. He was thin-skinned. He had a lot of trouble dealing with criticism and felt the need to strike out and to defend, not to strike out, to defend all the time. And some of his critics feel that, that's a blot on his character and so on. I suppose to complete the picture, there are some people, there's an article written in Commonweal not long ago, with the suggestion that he was a homosexual. Newman was never married. He had a lot of close relationships with both men and women. As I said, loved family life and so on. I asked a Newman scholar that just recently to check that out after I had read this in a published article, which didn't say he was a homosexual, but sort of leaned in that way or indicated that. And this scholar said, in his judgment, there was nothing to that was not his own sexual orientation. Well, a thumbnail sketch about some of the things about Newman. He was a dedicated man. I mean, we worked long hours. I mean, he worked 16, 18 hours when he was writing his Apologia Pro Vita Sua, his sort of autobiographical work. He worked, like a fiend. I mean, he just dedicated himself. He was a good pastor when he was in Birmingham. He'd go out and visit the people. He started after this Dublin University thing when he quit that because of pressures, because he had hoped that it would really be like for the whole British Isles, it would become a center of learning. But the English people weren't coming, were turning it off, and that bugged him. He had difficulties with Cullen, the Archbishop, and that hurt him. And the thing is also didn't feel he could divide his time between the oratory and in Birmingham and this other job, so he quit that. But after he did that, he started a school for younger kids. I don't know what age. I have the impression like they were like our grade school kids or maybe early high school, and he would teach them himself. Here's this brilliant scholar and who could teach, at the highest levels and so on, and he's right in there, and this is no problem for him. I mean, he's got no airs or anything. He's right in teaching these kids. So, I mean, there's a lot to recommend the man. But I think the impetus now is coming from people in Ireland and in the United States, the way I get it, who are, want to push Newman because they think he's a perfect antidote to the cultural problems of education, anti-intellectualism, and so on. The question is asking, what the modern media have to do with our problems of reading, writing, and intellectual life, and so on. I've dabbled in some of that in taking up the television question, which probably is the clearest manifestation of that. You have all of McLuhan's studies where we're moving away from being a linear-oriented culture to a more global sense of things. Certainly, I see that in the young people. It seems to me that their ways of thinking, perceiving, seem to me to be a little different. There's a book by Marie Wynn called Plug-in Drug, and in that book, Marie Wynn makes the point that that the television actually is affecting our brain development. That part of the brain does not get developed, the more rational and logical and linear parts of the brain don't get developed by watching television. I mean, with too much television watching, and that doesn't happen. And therefore, one's abilities to think in linear, logical, deductive ways are diminished. I don't know what to make of that. I've gone round and round with an expert on television on all this, and he takes a dim view of that kind of theory, so I don't know what to make of it. People are offering that. My layman's view of it is that it is affecting us. I mean, just at the common sense level, as you suggest, that people watch television instead of reading a book. I think I wrote that in one of my recent reflections, that maybe that would be a good stimulus for spiritual reading when the television program is more boring than usual. That one would turn it off and use that as a stimulus for reading something. But I think there's probably less reading. I watch my sister's kids and watch a television set and cartoons Saturday morning, and years ago they were younger, so on. I have to think that it has an effect on the whole reading business. I think it's in the picture. Kevin, you had your hand. Complicated question, but go ahead and finish and let me see if I can. That was one of his reasons for wanting to establish the Catholic University. He saw the way intellectuals were going. He was very taken with what we today call a 19th century notion of science, which of course he was in that time, which saw science as almost becoming an ism, scientism. That he had this model of science that it was sort of taking over, that he saw it first of all as this sort of individual in the laboratory and through his own mechanisms and so on being able to make advances, the great inventions and so on. But he saw science taking over, therefore, the role that theology had originally played. And as soon as it did that, it was getting into a field that didn't belong. And its scope was too narrow to contend with the business of dealing with life as a whole. And therefore you get what we today call reductionisms. That is, thinking of human things simply in terms of what you can measure and count and so on. We call that empiricism. Well, he definitely feared that and so on, and he needed to counter that. But I would say that he didn't fear wherever the intellectual pursuit would take you, as long as it was fair game. In other words, he thought the best you could do is set it up. You'd have your school of medicine, and it's got its autonomy, and you're not sneaking in theology there, really. But you've got theology being taught in the university, and that very thing, that teaching of theology, is going to suffuse the whole of the university. It's going to touch. And as soon as you get a fair fight, in a way, as soon as you get an interaction, he trusted it. See, Newman's an interesting combination of conservative and liberal, of being progressive. In many ways, he saw, what was happening in the modern world. Someone said he would have been really at home at the Second Vatican Council. He didn't go to the First Vatican Council. And that was in 1870, it would have been a nice time for him there. And he opposed, I'm off on the side point, but he opposed the infallibility thing. Interestingly enough, yeah, I know what I'm saying, that he would have fit in today. He was a harbinger of modernity, of the modern understanding of things. It was against, not that he thought infallibility was wrong, but he thought it wasn't time to define it. And the guys like Manning and his own church and so on who were pushing for it were just out of... One of his friends said what he wanted at that time was he'd be happy if every morning for breakfast he could have a new infallible statement by the Pope. I mean, that was the mood at the time. I mean, that's what the ultramontane people, as they were called, were calling for. I mean, they wanted infallibility bad. I mean, he wanted a new one every morning for breakfast, followed by the name of Ward. Well, Newman hated that and didn't want that, and thought that needed to be played down, didn't want it defined. His whole idea of the laity, and you could trust. Newman had a good, it's an odd outlook on the world. Some people have said the more I read about Newman, the more complex he becomes and the less I feel I really have hold on him. He's such a mixture of things. I mean, there's times when he sounds like the world is just sort of unimportant. The only world that really counts is the world of spirit and of God and the afterlife. And yet yet he is passionate about this world. He wants to change it. His whole energy is going into somehow making it better. It's an odd kind of thing. He loved, when he was made a cardinal, he went to Rome, he gave a famous talk. It was all on against liberalism. Of course, liberalism had a little different meaning at that time, but he was sort of taking a very conservative stance there in Rome. Yet in other things, he seemed to be so ahead of his time, progressive. Well, in answer to your question he thought that you couldn't make a university into a seminary. The bishops were upset because it was so free-floating. I mean, he had billiard tables, and then he didn't have too tight on hours to keep, and there was a free flow of things. I think in that sense he trusted the process. That's what I like about him. He didn't think that you couldn't dominate it, stifle it, keep everyone in line. That's how you were going to save Christianity. No, just keep theology alive. Keep that study going, and it will leaven the rest of it. Maybe right or wrong. Yes?
And so if theology
he really stayed as director of the Catholic University in Ireland only for 7 years, and quit after that time. That school kept going. As I say, the medical college is still going today, and it's commonly said that that was just a failure for Newman. And other people, I was again talking to still another guy from Ireland about all this, and he was telling me that is a misconception. He says within Ireland, it wasn't thought of that way, at least in his circle. You know, it was thought of he had done a good thing, established a good school, and had some successes, some failures, but on balance, it was a good thing. Hey, this is a tiny operation. I think he started with 20 or 30 students. You know, he didn't have 20,000 people there or anything. It's a small operation. In fact, Newman taught in a number of the classes himself, in addition to being director. He got a lot of personal attention in that particular place. But after that, he did these other things like establish this school for small boys. That's where he really taught after that. You have a problem built into your very question. You have equivocated on a particular word. That is, you have taken the word, what his intellect would tell him, and put it in contrast to what his conscience would say. In your comment, you identified conscience with heart, and so on. That is not the proper place to place conscience, my good man. Conscience is part of the intellectual virtue. Conscience has to do with judgment. The judgment that you make about what is the right or wrong thing to do. This is what Aquinas taught us and what Augustine has taught us. And this is the problem with this day and age, that they are not making that distinction properly. People have forgotten that, and they think that leading a good life is a matter of following the heart. The passions in the heart are trouble. You probably forgot when I wrote back a ways that the intellect to deal with the heart is like taking fine silk and trying to moor a boat, a large liner, such as it would be to control the passions and so on. So in your very question, you have equivocated there or not finely distinguished. Therefore, your question cannot be answered on its own terms. However, if I put it into my own terms then, that the problem is, does one follow one's heart, which is really symbol for emotions, or does one follow one's conscience, which is identified with judgment? The clear, obvious answer is that you must follow your judgment. That is what I did in my own life when I was at Oriel. My emotions all said to be there, and my head said to go elsewhere. That's a good question, Party. That's a good question. You know what? Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, right. Good question that you ask about that. You know, one thing that strikes me about our own time is that a lot of us feel that very fight. You know, a fight between, I'd put in my words, the head and the heart. You know? And we feel that tug, and it's often difficult because our heart's taking us one way, our head's taking us another way. And it seems to me that what we're trying to achieve in life is an integration of that. In other words, I feel best when I can respond, when I feel in sync. In other words, when my head and my heart are taking me in the same direction. That's where I feel we function best, we're with it, we're like what we're doing, we accomplish more. So if I saw that kind of opposition within me, then it seems to me that we have to try to examine what brings the opposition. I'd have to look more closely at the emotions taking me in another direction. and see if those emotions are appropriate or not. I'm a believer that the emotions are crucial in decision making. One of our first things is, where does our heart take us? Where does our intuition take us? I think we got to be in touch with that. And therefore, I got to ask myself if the negative emotions in this case are appropriate. If they're taking me in another direction, do they fit? Not every emotion is right. I mean, I don't buy this bit about, well, if you feel that way, you feel that way. What can you do about it? Well, you can do a lot about it. I mean, sometimes we're angry about things we shouldn't be angry about or should be getting over, and we ought to be able to figure out how to do that. So I don't buy the bit, if you feel it, you feel it. That's all. So I'm going to look to try to get them in sync. If they're not in sync, then I'm going to try to find out what causes the dissonance. If I find out the emotion is inappropriate, then I'm going to try to follow my more rational side here and make that decision and try to get the emotions to catch up with it. You know, sometimes by just behaving in a way, the emotions start to get there. You know, before long they're getting closer to how to act. So that's a good question, and it helps. It helps in a couple different things. That's a creative question. I really like that. But as an example, you see, I really think that's probably somewhat. I've read some dialogues of Newman with students, and what I did was sort of mild. He would probably have challenged you on what you meant on a number of the words and claimed you used loose language and so on. But now you take what I did as Newman's response. What's going to happen if I do that to an undergraduate student? He's talking at the break. You know, people feel so put down. And people, you know, probably laugh because as I responded that way, most people in the room who have heard me lecture or interact or someone probably have never heard me do that. I probably never heard me respond in that kind of way. It's a good point. A group of professors in one situation, and that's something I think about. Someone asked me at the break again. What I want to do in my class this next quarter is ask the students, I'm not sure I'm going to do this here, but I want to ask them, which one of you would be wanting me to challenge you in your statements? You know, who of you would like to be a guinea pig for this, or who would like that kind of challenge? It might be a way of doing it. But your point is well taken. You know, I suppose there's a more gentle way that would, you know, that maybe there's a way of making the same point in a more gentle way. I think what we said at the break here was really true. That is, people feel put down throughout their academic